The Trust. The traveller headed north. Waist-high golden strands swept to the deep chest of the horse and hid its hoofprints of sand. Sheer walls of stone towered to meet the sky. Giant birds wheeled around the rock, following the contours but when lifting, with but shifting feather on invisible rising plumes of warmth. Great rams from precarious vantages watched his passing, leapt alongside, effortlessly where it would not seem possible to stand. Massive beasts of thick, matted peat-brown hair that brushed the ground lumbered with horns wide as a path. Horns, ancient eyes, wet snout, and hooves that could crush stone were all that emerged from their dark, worn mass. Glaciers heaving all before them and crushing all beneath them carved their slow journey between the peaks. Wind ruled sound as it swept, as it focused to cool torrential streams to form cold, shaded rivers. The traveller's hair whipped and his facial hair froze with his breath. The late sun broke through evening storm clouds, sent horizontal rays across the surface, burning in color all that stood in its path. A vengeful, unleashed fury, force beyond death, the receipt of wrath, the receipt of fury, the honor of death. The traveller woke. The moon was high, its silver light entered by tall windows. The house was deserted but preserved. Its once owners were long departed, yet by night the house was hardly deserted. The air inside was still, a steady temperature, all was almost silent. Anonymous suggestions alone pierced the stillness. Scurrying in walls and floors was amplified in the vacuum. The empty rooms spoke of people, dusty people, faded people, the accumulations of people, but the people had gone. The house had turned inside out. The walls had become the rooms, spaces beneath floorboards the same. The rooms became the walls. Creatures warmed the house, but in hidden pockets, as if out of respect for a grave. They avoided the once-lived spaces of that great house. And so, while dust had settled, the once noble possessions remained untouched. 3 days he sheltered there, having arrived to emptiness, a house standing alone in a park within a forest. Gardens, once proud in formality, were now lost, overgrown, left to the haphazard, all-consuming, vacuum-filling forces of nature. The gates had stood ajar and immovable on massive rusty hinges. An archway of iron held high above visitors the arms of extinct nobility, a line of men born into war and the rewards of victory. Generation after generation, the line had retained the wealth and status afforded by periodic bouts of service to still higher powers. Sternly and jealously they guarded their power, through a projection that precluded question, until a power utterly unforeseen laid waste to all. It was a power that shook the foundations of kings with but the softest of breath, and with that power built silently but released suddenly an entire world of man fell. The house was a seat of the pillar of that world, one of many, more steadfast than its owners, but slowly itself succumbing to another force, that of nature, which would draw the forest into the park, and eventually even into the great houses with standing walls. Until then, animals used it as though it were the forest. It had already offered the shelter of trees, but it then represented a halfway point in that its former master's marks remained, a forest of carved stone and wood, of former libraries, dining, drawing, bed and sitting rooms. Paintings still hung on rotting damp canvases within thick frames upon the walls. The traveller walked through its rooms. His footsteps had echoed along the walls of a great hall. At each end stood a giant fireplace large enough to walk into, and like the gate to the drive, each was surmounted by the carved arms of those who had gone. He had returned but to an empty world, a world he had destroyed. His life was a construct formed by others long before him, a path that long pre-existed his life. He could not regret. The loss in his world was the primary objective of life, and he had been given 1,000 years in which to complete his task. The first quarter would be spent in training and preparation. For him it was his formative years. It was all he knew and completed. Now he understood it differently. It was his armor. It gave him the space to fight, with strength of will, a force far more powerful than himself, a force contrary to all he had known. The force was deceit, and it was cloaked in a supposed striving for betterment. It fed on misrepresentation, and to feed it built a civilization soaked in deception. Skill in deceit was rewarded, and inadvertently, over time, a growing need to perpetuate and increase the deception developed. Such was the nature and success of this force that eventually the civilization would grow to a strength dangerous to all life, and when the discrepancy became too great, the ties that held it all together would become apparent for their lack of substance. And so, having destroyed all else, the civilization would crumble and die. The traveler had been chosen, groomed to prevent that process. To do so, he would have to himself use the tools of his enemy, those of deceit. His activities would be extensive, and yet they would remain hidden. He would act against an enemy that was itself a master of subversion. He was not immune to the strength of his enemy, and his enemy was not ignorant of his presence. He knew this because he could sense the sickness, the enticing taste of the power. Man from his earliest days subconsciously knew that deceit provided the potential to give him the world, and the intoxicating power to destroy. All that was different about him, and it was a crucial difference, was that he held a shield, a conscious knowledge of his own weakness. Further, and equally crucial, this knowledge was born through his removed formation. He did not understand his weakness through a consciousness steeped in deceit, thus his knowledge could not deceive him as to its own weakness. Although he was a man, his earliest being had been formed in a space of emptiness, and all that had been built upon that foundation had been silent. Thus had he avoided the deep compromise of the psychological structure that so afflicted mankind, whose programmed prejudice ran so deep that objective thought had long been rendered impossible. The traveler looked down into the darkening valley. He could see a last faint warm light from a farmhouse. The windows were small, but the fireplace seemingly was large and candles burned. Nestled amongst trees, the farmhouse was made of thick grey stone walls and strong beams. It was alone in the valley. A powerful wind had descended to chill the water that swept from the grassy hillsides into the ever-emboldened streams below. He had waited till morning, and then approached, and a child, whom he took to be the farmer's daughter, had provided him a small jug of warm milk from the cow, and it was then he noticed the shimmering blue in her eyes. The traveler's eyes shifted upwards to discern the dark outline of the ridge, and then followed that line up and behind him to the saddle that would carry him further. He heard the farmer before he saw him. "What did you think you would find here?" the farmer asked the traveler. By the man's eyes, the traveler could tell he was not the father of the child. "I did not know what I would find. There used to be a settlement here. A great edifice was built on this ground where we stand." The traveler looked out over the flat expanse. Grasses waved, golden in color, waist-high. The man was shorter by far than the traveler, and stocky. He knew nothing of the distant past of this land, the land on which he had spent his life. He was old for his years. There was no grace in his movement. He was influenced more by the stone in the soil than by the grasses above it. He was hard and uncompromising, and though he asked the traveler of his expectations, it was not so much his curiosity that asked, but his view that there was nothing but stony soil and grass before them. The traveler stood silently. He had spoken less to the man than to muse upon the memory within himself. He had not known what to expect. The landscape of the preceding days was as he had always known it, but what lay upon the land had changed. A shift had occurred, as though all trace of what had been had disappeared since he last stood and looked out over this land. He had known this place. He had been fundamental to the creation of what was now gone. Looking closer, the ground, the soil, was rockier than before. When he first saw this space soft and deep, a lake of earth in a basin of stone, and this lake had been employed in the growth of trees, and in the gardens that grew amid structures founded upon the stone deep beneath. The structures were built of the stone. They sprawled over the landscape to house a 1,200-strong community that would touch every major incident the world knew for 200 years. And then they disappeared, and the memory of them also, as generations subsumed what little knowledge there had been, and disbelief destroyed what had even then been incomprehensible. The traveler had directed the completion of this place. He had chosen the valley, he had chosen the manner of building, he had chosen those who had been there, and then at some point he had left it to its workings. Since then he had been far, wandering and watching in silence and solitude. As time passed, he realized the presence of his creation to be less and less distinct. He had been far away, and he knew the moment the doors had closed on his creation, and the moment those he had placed there vanished like a once relevant impetus. A core had overseen the disintegration of their monuments, and had then themselves dispersed. The traveler looked down at his feet and moved the soil with his staff. This stone in the soil, like the unsettled dust that hangs disturbed in the air, it remains and will for a time, as there is more to come. He spoke quietly. The man had turned and walked a short distance away, lost in thoughts of his own. The traveler looked over the fields. A shining haze of shimmering, swaying gold meets my eye. Where once was color and the cold of stone, the grasses have returned, and the richness of the gold, dispersed to flower and tree, invested in strength, is with the sun once more. "Do you have a family?" the traveler asked the man. Returning from his thoughts and turning as though awoken and reminded of a forgotten presence, the man looked at the traveler and replied that he did not. "What do you live for, if not for that?" the traveler asked. "I once lived for that, but I lost them. A wife and a daughter. A storm came. Until then I tilled for their bread. Now I till for mine, and for the girl, and for the sun in the west. No more for the sun in the east. Now I wait for another storm, the storm that will take me to them." The man came across as stern, but the traveler could sense that he was unsure. The man realized he knew nothing of his own fate, let alone the fate of his wife and daughter, of whom he had heard nothing for many years. All he knew for sure was that they had gone. Perhaps he sensed that his loss of them was not to be undone, that the storm would fetch him but would deliver him somewhere else, that after all of his toil he remained alone, that he had been tilling alone for his own bread even before they departed. The traveler watched him from the shadow of his hat. And the man fell silent. Breezes continued to move the grass like waves of silken thread that caught different aspects of light and cast them about like visibly audible notes. "I just till," the man continued. "I don't know why, I don't ask. I used to assume I knew, and then I didn't even do that anymore." The man was not used to talking. He was outwardly uncomfortable, but he felt somehow inclined to respond, to consider, and to match his thoughts to rusty foreign words. "I needed to feed my family. They were hungry. I needed to feed myself so that I could feed them. I fed them and attended to their needs. That was that. There was little more to life. We lived." The man paused. "Now I live. I just live." "Just animal," the traveler thought to himself, but then said, "Your storm will come." But then he thought to himself, steadfast man's resolve ever to press forward, so steadfast where no guide of true substance would say why. For the man the storm would lead nowhere. So steadfast, thought the traveler, but even where an obvious impetus existed, a deemed responsibility, the why remained. At least there had been something to grasp when the responsibility remained, but when this man's family was swept away, what remained? A sunrise avoided, a sunset sought, but never actually hastened. The man lived, he tilled, he did not question, he did not know. His life was in steady machinations. There was nothing more. He ruminated on little. When he did speak, he had said it was with the girl who came, he said, from the forest. He did not travel. He remained where he was. He remained as he was, growing older, but never seeing more one day to the next, just more west than east. And with each strike of lightning over the hills, he wondered whether the thunder would be strong enough to shock his soul enough that he might finally die. The traveler also looked to the hills, but for him the thunder would never sweep him away. Rather, it was the source he followed. Thunder fed the tiller, and like the man, the traveler had spent a lifetime nurturing, tilling. He had prepared grounds, raised a family, headed and directed that family from a position of power, but unlike the man in the man's world, in the context of the traveler's family, of all of those he had known, it was the traveler that had left. He left, but only after having given instructions to love and then to die. Like the man, he outlived his family. He was always going to outlive them, but their influence would extend to silently color all, with an exponential influence, invisible in its source, an old man who had never been young. The traveler had been the instrument of another, and his perspective was limited in that he could not know his instructor's intended outcome. Just as the mechanism he had created acted according to his will, he in turn acted according to the old man's will. And now that his task was completed, he saw its remains, the stones in the soil, a lost power, exerted to influence, dissipated until forgotten. 2 tasks had driven the 2 men who stood before the valley, both tasks shrouded in mystery. One sought simply to survive until death, the other to create and then to destroy. Both followed blindly in their respective paths. one because he did not question, the other because he knew his role. Both would meet their end, but while one waited for a storm, the other would be the storm. The traveler moved silently to his horse and reached out with his free hand to stroke its nose and cheek. The horse, extending its neck, rested its nose against his chest and breathed deeply, filling its enormous weight with its master. The traveler turned once more to the man. Once there was here what now has dispersed. A storm will rise that will sweep from those hills and take all that stands before it. But you, gone by then, will till the ground for your family no more. With a gesture, the man fell to the earth in the field. The young woman silently looked on, and then the traveler watched as she fetched a spade with which to dig. He watched her as she dug. He watched as she rolled the man into his grave, as she filled the hole, as she collected the wood for the fire and burned a pyre late into the night. As the flames died down and only the stars remained, the traveler could see the blue shimmering from her skin. The traveler knew it was now her time, and she looked straight into his eyes and then retired to the forest. In the new moon, her skin lit the woodland where she entered, and he knew her nest would be near. For 5 suns a wolf prowled in protection of the sleeping girl. Through the trees he watched at night, and each evening she would make her nest at the feet of trees, and he could see her eyes peering for him, peering for the wolf form, peering for the shimmer of his silver. As the suns passed, he neared her resting form, her body pleading in anticipation, her mind waiting with eyes closed as he came close to sniff and watch over, and then she would dream of his nearing form, of his voice as she slept, of the stories he told, of the brothers and sisters of the blue, and of the day when the 5th sun would pass and he would arrive, and she would give herself to him, to his scent and to his will. And then in her protected nest she knew the wolf father, became a mother of wolves, and from her womb a new pack would populate that long-lost valley.